Before the name Egypt was ever whispered by foreign tongues, the people of the river knew their world by a different name, a name born of the soil itself. Kemet, the Black Land. This was not poetry, but a stark declaration of reality. Each year, the great artery of the Nile would swell and burst its banks, a deluge of life. And when it receded, it left behind a gift, a dark, lustrous ribbon of fertile silt, a promise of sustenance for millions. To step beyond this sacred black earth was to enter another realm entirely. The Desert, the Red Land. A domain of shimmering heat, endless dust, and profound danger. Here, on this razor's edge between existence and oblivion, an entire identity was forged in color. Black, the color of creation and life. Red, the color of chaos and death. So when we seek the architect of this civilization, the first answer is not a pharaoh, nor a dynasty. It is a covenant, sealed not in words, but in silt and survival. A partnership between a river that delivered the world and a people who learned to orchestrate their lives around its immutable rhythm. But this truth unearths a deeper mystery. How does a scattered collection of riverside settlements, bound to the seasons, transform into a unified state? A power capable of commanding mountains of stone, inventing eternity in script, and shaping a faith so potent its shadow still falls across millennia. Long before the first pyramids sliced the horizon, the Nile Valley was a fragile chain of villages. For countless generations, they existed in a delicate dance of trade and warfare, slowly coalescing into two distinct political spheres: Upper Egypt in the arid south and Lower Egypt in the marshy northern delta. They vied for dominance over the river, the singular highway of commerce and conquest. Then, at the dawn of recorded history, the narrative sharpens. The two lands become one. Later traditions would crystallize this monumental event in the figure of a single king, a unifier often called Narmer, who first wore the combined crown. This act of unification becomes the bedrock of Egyptian identity, the moment a nation was willed into being. But unification was Merton with breathtaking speed. A new class of scribes emerged, their reed pens tracking the lifeblood of the nation: grain. Grain became taxation. Taxation funded labor on a scale never before imagined. And that labor, organized with terrifying precision, turned to stone. Quarries, once simple pits, became the start of immense supply lines. Armies of workers were fed, housed, and directed, season after season. The impossible was rendered routine, not through magic, but through the sheer, grinding power of logistics. This newfound power was immediately turned toward eternity. Tombs were not mere graves, but machines for rebirth, aligned with the celestial pathways of the stars. Temples were laid out as cosmic maps, earthly dwellings for the gods. And in the Old Kingdom, this royal authority hardened into stone on a scale that still defies comprehension. Then, the fundamental pattern of Egyptian history asserts itself: a cycle of birth, decay, and renewal. Central power dissolves, ambitious provincial governors pull away, the nation fractures, only to be stitched back together by a new, determined dynasty. In the Middle Kingdom, Kemet is reborn, projecting an image of stoic stability. In the New Kingdom, it strides onto the world stage, forging an empire in bronze and belief. The pharaoh is now both warrior and high priest, the sole guardian of Ma'at, the divine concept of order, truth, and cosmic balance. They built for 10,000 years a civilization obsessed with permanence, locked in a struggle against the one force it could never defeat, time itself. And in their silent stone monuments—
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
they leave us with a question that echoes from their world into ours. What does it mean to build a legacy that so profoundly outlives the hands that built it and the very beliefs that gave it form? How does a civilization endure when the relentless erosion of centuries seeks to tear it apart? For millennia, its identity was written in stone, yet its voice was lost to the wind. An enigma haunted the modern world. Here was a culture that had lasted for thousands of years, its monuments piercing the skyline, defiant against the desert sands. Yet for so long, we misunderstood it completely. Outsiders could walk through the colossal temples of Karnak and Luxor, their eyes tracing walls covered in a universe of intricate symbols, and comprehend nothing. The Great Pyramids were a wonder of the world, but the language of their builders was utterly silent, a vast library locked behind impenetrable glass. The story of ancient Egypt was visible everywhere, but it could not be heard. The question of its discovery, then, is not merely one of archaeology, of shovels and sand. It is a story of decipherment. It is about the singular moment a key was found, a key that could turn mute stone back into living speech. That moment begins in the year 1799, amidst the chaos of Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Egypt. French soldiers were reinforcing the defenses of a dilapidated fortification near the port town of Rachid, which they called Fort Julien. An army officer, Pierre-François Bouchard, was supervising the work. He was not hunting for treasure, he was a soldier, engaged in the pragmatic business of war. But his eyes fell upon a dark, basalt slab that had been repurposed as part of a wall. He saw at once that it was significant. It was not one text, but three, each carved in a different script. At the top, the sacred pictorial elegance of hieroglyphs. In the middle, the cursive shorthand of Demotic, the people's script. And at the bottom, a language the world still knew, ancient Greek. It was the same decree, issued in three distinct forms. What Bouchard had unearthed was not just an artifact, it was a potential translation machine. It was a bridge across time, a way to compare a known language to two that were utterly lost. The text itself was mundane, a piece of state bureaucracy from 196 before the Common Era, issued by a council of priests to honor the young king Ptolemy V. On the surface, it was a list of honors and tax exemptions, but its consequence was revolutionary. Copies of the inscription were made, circulated among the great minds of Europe, sparking a fierce intellectual race. Scholars sensed that this slab, which would become known as the Rosetta Stone, held the power to reopen a sealed civilization. Then, after 2 decades of intense study and false starts, came the second discovery, the one that changed everything. In the year 1822, a brilliant and obsessed French scholar named Jean-François Champollion announced a breakthrough that echoed through the halls of history. He had proven that the hieroglyphs—
And now comes the part no one talks about. But this is where the real mystery begins.
were not merely symbolic pictures, an esoteric code of ideas. They could also represent sounds. The script was phonetic, An eagle was not just an eagle, it could also stand for the sound A. A lion was not just a lion, it could be the sound L. With that stunning epiphany, the walls of Egypt began to speak again. The silence of 2,000 years was broken. Cartouches revealed the names of pharaohs. Titles etched on statues regained their meaning. Prayers carved into tomb walls became coherent sentences. Bureaucratic records, once meaningless patterns, became history. This is how the land of Kemet was truly rediscovered. Not as a myth, not as a biblical backdrop, but as a civilization finally capable of telling its own story in its own words. And what a story those recovered voices told. They revealed a culture far more ancient and complex than the postcard version of pyramids and sphinxes. They spoke of a timeline stretching back into the 4th millennium before the Common Era, a society evolving through grand kingdoms and collapsing into periods of chaos only to rise again. They chronicled internal upheavals, daring religious experiments, and shifting centers of power. They showed a people who survived not by remaining static, but by constantly reinventing themselves, all while holding to a core, unwavering idea that the Nile is the source of all life and that cosmic order, Ma'at, must be perpetually maintained against the forces of chaos. The stone was not the treasure. The treasure was the voice it unlocked. For a civilization does not truly survive in its monuments, but in its memory, carried forward not by rock and gold, but by the enduring power of its words. History does not pause for admiration. By the late centuries, the great river valley found itself constricted kingdom, endured the humiliation of foreign domination, suffering long periods of Persian rule. The sense grew that the two lands were no longer a master of their own destiny, but a prize to be passed between larger, hungrier powers. This is the world a young Macedonian king walks into in 332 BCE. He finds not a sleeping kingdom, but an ancient civilization with a long and bitter memory, its people simmering with resentment, ready to cast off the Persian yoke. Historical accounts tell of a population that welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Egypt, a land that once moved mountains for its god-kings, changes hands without a single battle worthy of legend. That fact alone is unsettling. How does a civilization that built monuments to outlast time itself capitulate to a new master so easily? What did they believe they were gaining? And what, in their desperation, were they about to lose? Conquest, however, is merely the surface of the story. Alexander understood a deeper truth. To rule Egypt was not merely to command its armies, but to inhabit its sacred order. He journeyed deep into the unforgiving western desert to the remote Siwa oasis to consult the famed oracle of Amun. There, he sought not military advice, but divine legitimacy, a validation that both Greeks and Egyptians could respect. He emerged, it was said, as the son of a god. Then, on the Mediterranean coast, he laid the foundations for a new world. Alexandria. It was an engineered crossroads, a crucible designed for the collision of cultures, a place where Greek logic and Egyptian mysticism would blend, compete, and forge something entirely new. The Black Land, Kemet, which began as a society born of the annual flood, which unified itself into a singular kingdom and perfected the art of building for eternity, was now folded into a new global system. After Alexander's death, Egypt passed to his general, Ptolemy, whose descendants would rule for 3 centuries. They governed through a careful fusion, these Greek pharaohs who took the ancient titles, who worshipped in the old temples, but who administered their kingdom with a Hellenistic mind. It was an age of ancient gods and new political realities. And so the ultimate question hangs over the sand. Is the true Egypt the name outsiders gave it? Or is it the identity its people gave themselves? Kemet, the Black Land. If a single stone, pulled from a fort wall in 1799, could unlock thousands of years of silence, what other chapters of this story are still sealed, awaiting the next key? 13 years. That is all the time it took for one man to conquer the known world. 13 years for a youth from Macedon to forge an empire stretching from the shores of Greece to the rivers of India. Was it genius? Was it luck? Or was it a hunger so profound it consumed all that lay before it? Behind the legendary victories lurk shadows, and behind the ambition lies a cost paid in blood and chaos. His is a story of absolute power, of a legacy that echoes through time, a testament not only to what a single human can build, but also to what they can destroy.
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.